Hi guys, hi, how's it going? How you doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I'm doing the next video in my palette roulette series in which I review a palette that is in my collection that might also be in your collection. It doesn't necessarily have to be the brandest, newest palette, but it is a palette that I just want to see some usage out of because I like to get some use out of my things. While sometimes it might be a new palette, most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's not a new palette. With that said, for those of you new here, hi, my name is Donna. I'm a lover of all things high-end colorful beauty and self-care. I also work in the beauty industry as a field leader for Ulta Beauty, so I get a lot of education in my position. I like to bring you that education here. But ultimately, I just like to talk about makeup. And I'm assuming if you're here, you also like to talk about makeup. So we're just going to jump in. Let's just jump in. All right. So today we are going to be reviewing two melt palettes, one of which is actually not a new palette. It is the Millennial Pinx palette, and then the other one is their newest one on the market, which is the Electrip palette, and it's their 420-esque palette for the year. I am so excited to dive into these palettes with you because I have some things to share. I hope that you guys are in it for the experience of all things Melt, Millennial Pinx, and Electrip today. I am a fan of Melt. Like, there is not very many of their palettes that I have reviewed that I don't really like, but I will say that Melt is probably not my favorite formula because while it is, really super pigmented and the mattes are typically really, really amazing, they're also very fickle. Their shimmers aren't typically amazing. These palettes are not any different from that, and this isn't a formula that I would ever suggest a new person start to utilize because it just takes so much finessing of the shadows to make them work for your eyes. So I'm going to handle these as two separate palettes, obviously, because they are two separate palettes. I'm going to start with Melt Millennial Pinx. So this is the Melt Millennial Pinx palette. This palette is a $58 palette, and it comes with 10 shadows, 0.66 ounces of product, or 0.067 ounces per pan. And it has 3.7 stars on Nordstrom with 147 reviews, 3.2 stars on Sephora with 97 reviews, and I wish I had looked at the star rating prior to picking up this palette. So this is what the outside of the packaging looks like. I do love that this is very tactile. It feels like raised and bumpy, and then it says Millennial Pinx, Melt Cosmetics. The back of the palette just also says Melt. It says Millennial Pinx in a bunch of different like fonts in a different kind of like shiny writing along the back of it. And then on the inside, you do get a nice mirror, of course, just like any other Melt palette. And this is what the color story looks like. Look, I think that this is a beautiful color story. I really do. I think that pinks and blues and grays are beautiful. What I love about this silver is that it leans very blue toned. It is the silver that's on my eye look today. It's a beautiful color. 10 shades and a relatively unique color story. Sure. 5 mattes, 5 shimmers, which if you know much about Melt Cosmetics, most of their palettes are mostly mattes with like 2 shimmers. So this having the 50% one, 50% the other ratio was like calling to my soul because I like that kind of ratio in a palette. But like I said earlier, Melt's shimmers are kind of where they fail, to be honest. The mattes in this palette, there's a great range from super ultra light to super ultra deep. This is a black. This one is kind of a really pretty like baby doll pink shade. It is a beautiful shade. The lightest pink works really well as a highlighter for me. It worked really well in my brow bone, in my inner corner. I really liked it in that way. I can see how that's not going to be a light enough shade for many other skin tones, but it worked very much like those brightening powders that are out on the market now for me and my skin tone. These were very dense, these were very opaque, and they were pretty powdery in the pan. That's not unheard of for Milk Cosmetics. What I would say is just because they're powdery in the pan doesn't mean it's going to equate to fall out all over your face. But I did see a lot of fallout from this palette, especially with the deeper shades. A lot more than I'm used to with Milk Cosmetics. Most of the shadows in this palette specifically did not blend super well. I had to pull other colors from the other palette that I was working with, or my Project Pan palette, in order to get the blend to be not so patchy and not so muddy. I would say that the black was the worst for patchiness, and the black was the worst, of course, for fallout. But it is a black. It's a black shade, and that's pretty typical of most black shades. All of them were buildable, which I loved because none of them were super pigmented, and I felt like none of them really showed up quite the way they do in here on your eye. The fact that they were buildable was awesome because that made them functional because you could build on top of them and they would like blend in that way, like pat, 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 not so much blendy strokes, which is whatever. The shimmers in here all had issues. Every single one of the shimmers in here had issues. The silver that is on my eye look today, I think this is the best that I've gotten it to look, and that's because I put down a ColourPop Super Shock shadow over the top of the silver just so that the like areas where it was voiding or it was patchy could be filled in with another color. I mean, what you see here is not just this color. It's other shimmers to make sure that it wasn't patchy. I would say that this is more of a topper, but I feel like it's too opaque to be a topper, and it does have that chunky feel that a topper has, but not enough to be just a topper. It's too much to be just a topper, I guess is where I'm trying to go with it. They all had a ton of fallout, and they were soft and crumbly in the pan. They tended to move around on the eyelid, which is why I blended so far up with this shimmer. As I was using this palette more, the shimmers got further and further up closer towards my brow bone because I knew that they were going to end up there anyway. So why not just put them there already so that I'm not frustrated when it destroys the whole look. I would say that they all applied really well in one swipe across the lid, either with your finger or with a brush. But if you wanted the opacity that is in the pan, you definitely had to build them up. These shimmers didn't build super well. As you built them on top of each other, they became more and more textured and really exacerbated any kind of texture that you had on your eyes, which is why instead of packing on a bunch of the same shadow to create the eye look that I wanted to create today, I put a Super Shock on top of it. I will say that this palette that's been in my project pan and my deck of panning and what I'm just trying to get use out of it did see a lot of use in the shimmers because I was able to pack these shimmers on top of these shimmers to get them to look the way I wanted to and to be even and smooth across the eyelid instead of texturized across the eyelid, which is saying a lot because this palette is like 6 years old in my collection and this one is brand new. I do know that this palette came out in 2020. I know that it's an older palette on the market, but it still should perform way better than one that's been in my collection for 6 years by Tarte, nonetheless. They don't apply really well with a brush. If you want to use a brush, you're going to find that the application is just meh at best. Ultimately, even with your finger, the shimmers in this palette are pretty lackluster. What I would also say is that the shimmers in this palette also feel very heavy, and I don't like anything on my eyes anything on my skin to feel as heavy as some of these did. So these weren't my favorite shimmers to use. They are pretty, really, if we get down to it, the shimmers, which are this one here, this one here, this one, and this one, They're pretty, but they're just kind of ho-hum, and really, I really wanted more from that palette is where I'm going with that. The wear time on these is about 7 hours. They do wear better if you have a primer on. Without a primer on your eyes, you're going to see probably around the 5 hour mark from these before you see significant movement of your shimmer shadows. And I wouldn't say necessarily that the mattes fade, but they do oxidize a little bit on the eye as you're wearing them. Most of them are just frankly awful, to be honest. Save your money on that palette. There's that. I did get it for sale at Sephora. I think it was on like a heavy discount. I think I got it for like 24 bucks when I picked up this guy. So I'm not mad at spending $24 on it. I'm super glad I didn't pay $58 for it, and wouldn't repurchase it. That is definitely going in my worst of category at the end of the year. The second melt palette that I brought into this is this one. This is the Electrip palette, and this one did launch this year. This one also is a $58 palette. This one also has 0.66 ounces of product in it, or 0.067 ounces per pan. It also has 10 shades in it, and it has a 3.5 star rating on Sephora, but it only had 8 reviews that made up that 3.5 star rating. So I need to give it the benefit of the doubt. And also, Melt Cosmetics doesn't have the best eyeshadow formula, in my humble opinion, most of the time. I love them, but you have to finesse their eyeshadows. I can't remember when this launched, to be honest, but I know it was this year. They always come out with like a palette around $4.20. I do believe that that is this palette's timeline. This is called the Electrip. The front of it looks very like groovy, trippy, like what you would see in a daze from being maybe too high. It was inspired by Bright Lucid Dreams to encompass Melt's passion for 420. It's got 4 mattes, 6 shimmers. So I don't think that I read that necessarily before I picked up the palette. And I'm just going to remind you that I think of Melt's eyeshadows, their mattes are the best. Their shimmers, not so much. So the back of the palette does just have, you know, again, the Melt logo and all the information about Melt. And then it's got like squiggly lines across it that go like straight on one side, which I thought was really cool. You open it up, of course, you have the mirror that is normal for Melt Cosmetics, and then you have the palette. So this is what this palette looks like. This one, again, only has 4 mattes. Those 4 mattes were this blue, which is in my eye look today, this brown, which I wore so often, this like corally color, and this red, which I also wore so often. I love that red tone. I love the coral. I love all the mattes in this palette. I loved the mattes in this palette. Far superior than the mattes in the Millennial Pinx palette. These were great mattes also, I think, for the color story of the shimmers in this palette. So this red one and coral one worked really well with the 3 shimmers here. The brown and the coral worked really well with, you know, these shimmers here. And then this blue one worked really well with the 3 shimmers that are down here. So I think that it spoke to each other. It did a really great job of working well with its other people in the palette. Its other shades in the palette. They needed to be built up because these shadows, for whatever reason, weren't as pigmented as most Melt shadows have been in the past for me. They were all pigmented, but as you blended them, they kind of not blended away, but sheared out really, really well, which is not something that Melt Cosmetics is known for. Their shadows typically stick around for the long haul. Once you place them, you're done. These ones actually blended so very well. What I would say about that, though, is they needed to be built up to have the same kind of opacity and pigmentation that you saw in the palette, but there was no problems with that. I did not have any problems building these shadows on each other, I also had no problem blending these shadows out. They didn't get muddy, they didn't void, they weren't super patchy. Really, really great shadows. And for as pigmented and colorful as these mattes are, you kind of expect a little bit of that like patchiness to just be there as a part of the color of the shadow, i.e. this blue should have been an awful mess to work with, but it was probably one of my favorite ones to work with, and I worked with it often. What I would say about this palette also is that because of how pigmented they were but blendable they worked really, really well with each other for like a 1 or 2 eyeshadow look. So like I would put this one and this one on my eyes, but it would look like I had a multi-tone effect on my eye using this one, blending it out, and then using it again and going in a little bit deeper in certain spots. Same can be said for this blue. I have just that blue and just this silver, and then the like ColourPop Super Shock tapped over the top of the silver, but you would think that this eye look has multiple different tones of blue in it, and it's just that blue. So I could create a lot of 1 or 2 eyeshadow looks utilizing this palette, and I love that. It was super easy to use. I also didn't see a whole lot of fallout with this palette at all, which is shocking because the mattes in this are very vibrant. And typically with those more vibrant pigments, you're going to see a lot of fallout. The shimmers were pretty melty, right? They pretty melty, pretty melt-esque, pretty reminiscent of what Melt always does. They weren't much better than I would say the average Melt Cosmetics palette, but they were much better than those Millennial Pinx shimmers. So they weren't as inconsistent as most Melt shimmers are, but they were still inconsistent. And with 6 of those being shimmers in this 10 pan eyeshadow palette, I would think that they would lean a little bit heavier into creating a little bit more consistency with the palette. The lightest orange in here performs like poop. It might as well be transparent. It might as well not have a color to it. Because you couldn't see it on an eye look unless you were packing it over the top of a deeper color, or like even a white. You could see a little bit, but not like a lot of it, and it took a lot to pack it on, and therefore it created some texture that you may not have wanted in your eye look. I liked using it as a topper to create a little bit more dimension, because then I didn't need the opacity of the color to be there, and it worked well over the top of any of these eyeshadows, any of those eyeshadows, because its lack of pigmentation within itself. The black based blue, which is right here, it is called Galactic Love, was actually quite a bit more pretty than I thought it was. I thought about putting it in my eye look today, but I really wanted to showcase a 2 shadow eye look. It really was a whole lot better than most black based shimmers are. I found that I didn't have to work super hard to make sure that the shimmer showed up, and I also felt like I didn't have to work super hard to get it to adhere to my eyelid for a lengthy amount of time. Like, it did a really good job of being blue throughout the day. Sometimes with those black based shimmers, the shimmer rubs away by the end of the day and you're just left with this like muddy black mess on your eyes. I didn't find that to be true with this shadow, which was far superior than I have seen Melt do with a black based shimmer in the past. This green, loved it. This blue, oh my god, beautiful. I really did like this palette. It wore for approximately 9 hours, so by itself it was already better than this one because the longevity was definitely there. With a primer, it's going to last longer. Without a primer, it lasts probably around that 7-hour mark. I did see some fading with this one, but I almost prefer fading than I do oxidization, like I was seeing in this palette, specifically with this shadow here, which was my favorite one to use in this palette. So there's that. Yeah, I really enjoyed that palette. So Of the two palettes, this one will go probably in my mediocre section of the palettes that I use this year when I get down to it in my ranking. This one will definitely be one of the worst. Let's go through some swatches now. I want to make sure that you get to see the swatches. I will tell you, it swatches quite well. Do not trust the swatch. Don't trust the swatch. So we're going to do Millennial Pink first. Rosé Brunch right there, which is a beautiful, like, kind of cooler tone baby pink shimmer. It feels really good to the touch. I think that it wants to be a duo-ish chrome in that it kind of flips from like this golden, like rose gold to this like muted pink, but it's still pink nonetheless. Then we have this one, which is Pink Leather. Pink Leather is a baby doll pink matte, and it was probably one of my favorite in the palette to use. I could use it for just about anything. Inner corner highlight, brow bone. It worked really well. I could also use it for, you know, transition shade if I needed to. It was really good at blending out shades. I loved it, actually. One of my favorites in the palette. And then I have this one, which is Flamingo Dream. Really beautiful coral matte. I think that if they had performed in the way that I'm seeing them swatch, I would have been so happy with this palette, but that's just not how it was. Then I have this one, which is Mixed Emotions. This one really lent to texture. Like, this one felt super creamy in the pan. It really felt like it was going to lay on the eye well. I just felt like it didn't. It was really actually texturizing on the eye. And then Modern Love is, I'm going to put it over here. Modern Love is this kind of like dusty, antique-y rose color that I wanted to love so much, but this is not how it performed in an eye. And it actually kind of oxidized at the end of the day. It looked really milky and almost sickly on my eye versus as pigmented and beautiful as it's showing. Ruby Spar. This was probably the worst of the shimmers. I felt like it was maybe just too creamy. It moved all over the place and actually creased, and it was just awful. It was chunky and it was awful. That's all I got to say about that. Beautiful color, awful. This one called Pink Noise. I think it's trying to be a white pink duochrome. It was chunky and it was exacerbating of texture, and it was really great as a topper, but that's about it. This one, worst shadow in the palette, and it is called Moonglow. I think that you guys can see, like, I want more from a silver than that, and there's a lot of like patchiness towards the top. I just wanted more from a silver than what this shadow is giving me. It just also didn't look good on the eyes without being tapped over the top of with another shadow. It didn't matter whether it was wet or dry. It was just an awful shadow. Then I have GF, which is the gray in the palette, and it's kind of like a charcoaly, like almost blue, slatey blue gray. It's a really pretty shadow, but at best only for outer V, because it didn't really function well in an eye look. It didn't blend out well. It was very patchy. It avoided shadows underneath of it. It didn't want to build very well. It was just, it wasn't pretty. And then we have the black, which also I think didn't really need to exist in this palette with that kind of slatey blue gray. This one's name was Euphoria, and I feel like it, I mean, it was a really deep black, but it also was not a really awesome black. Again, you can see kind of some of the voiding that's happening in the crease area. I found that even the mattes did that with this palette. If they happenstanced into a crease, they would crease out. I think that you could probably also see that even in this eye look, and a lot of that is happening because of the silver that is in this eye look from this palette. And just because we're talking about it, I know that a lot of people who put shimmers into their crease, find that the shimmers will crease in their crease, especially if they have slightly hooded eyes. I've never really had that problem. I don't have oily eyelids. I don't have like moist eyelids. Like once I don't really technically have very many struggles with keeping an eyeshadow in an eye look in the way I want it to be in an eye look. With these shadows, I felt like they ruined almost every eye look that I put them into. I also wished I would have paused before I washed off my swatch fingers, because I think that had you seen like how they were on my fingers, it might give you more indications of how they go onto your eyes, because some of them were still like spotty and like fally outy on my fingers, which is just very strange. So now we're going to swatch the Electrip palette, and this one, again, swatches are not necessarily the make or break moment for an eyeshadow. Let's remember that, because not always do the ones that swatch horribly work horribly, and not always do the ones that swatch well work well. So here is Electrip. The first one we have here is Strawberry Fields, an orange leaning red matte. Really beautiful. I loved how this one functioned in an eye look. Then we have this one here, which is Head Trip, and it is an orange shimmer. Then we have Saturn, which is the one that I said was the worst one in the palette. I think that you guys can see, like you can hardly see it on my hand. It just lacks a serious amount of pigmentation. Works really well as a topper, but that's about as best as you're going to get out of it. If you try and put it all over the lid as the lid shimmer and then a color on the outside, you're going to look like you just had that color on the outside. There's not really any impact that this shadow brings to an eye look. And then we have the kind of coral matte, which is called Bang, B-H-A-N-G. Really, really beautiful coral tone. I really enjoyed this shade. It worked so well at blending out this red, and just in an eye look with that red was stunning. Then I have Far Out, which I'm going to put over here, which is kind of a, you know, antique bronzy colored gold, which I loved, actually. I don't typically pull for those kind of colors. What I will say is different about these shadows also from the Millennial Pinx shadows is the Millennial Pinx shadows felt really creamy and emollient, whereas these ones feel more grippy in the pan and almost sandpaper-like. So I feel like that is Melt's sweet spot when they move to a more emollient formula. It did not work for them. So this one is called Reefer, and it is the matte deep brown. This one swatches horribly, but it is actually a really, really good matte deep brown. I used it all the time, and this one with this, perfect eye look. Then we have Galactic Love, which is the black-based blue shimmer. I mean, look at that. That is stunning, and that's what it looks like in your eye look the whole day while you're wearing it. It shocked me. Then we have the teal matte that is in my eye look today. This one is called Pseudo. I mean, it's super pretty. And then we have Blue Heaven, which quite possibly one of my favorite. That's a pinky swatch, so I'm going to go back in and do it again. Quite possibly one of my favorite, like, baby blue shimmers. So, so, so pretty. And that swatch doesn't do it justice. It is a pinky swatch, so just so we're aware, pinky swatches are shit. Okay, then I have Magic Mush, and this is the last one, and this was my, holy cow, my favorite chartreusey green. It is part of what is on my lower lash line today. Just a really, really beautiful shimmer chartreuse green. I mean, look at the difference between these swatches and these swatches. Can you guys see just the overall opacity difference, the overall like impact difference? I just feel like, holding them up together like that says everything it needs to say about the two different palettes. So at the end of the day, I'll be keeping both of the palettes, but like the Millennial Pinks could probably go into my meh category, my like palettes on the chopping block kind of category if I had that kind of mindset in my collection. But like, I'm not going to get rid of it anytime soon, but it would be one that I probably, if somebody came in and was like, oh my God, I love that. Like, say my sister was going through my collection and she's like, oh my God, I love that color story. I'd be like, here you go. Not because I don't want, not because I want her to suffer with her eyeshadow routine, but because I just don't love the palettes. So there's that. I am done with these palettes. Super happy to be done with these palettes. So I'm going to go pick a new palette. I will be right back. Okay, I think this is because I've seen such great reviews over this palette for such a long time, since it came out basically. And I want to see how I feel about it, because this is not a brand that I typically pull for. And I'm actually pretty shocked that this is the palette that I'm pulling out, considering that I have some Natasha Denona palettes in there that I haven't even touched since right after I purchased them. And even then, like, one of them I haven't touched, period. One of them, and the other two I've touched. I did like a get ready with me with them, but I haven't done a palette roulette on. So I'm surprised that this is what I picked. But I am going to go with the Too Faced Italian Spritz palette. You guys, I've just heard some really great things about this palette, and I'm kind of interested in potentially what this is, because I've heard it's amazing. This is what it looks like outside of the box, and this is the color story. So pretty ho-hum, pretty but also really great for summer moving into fall, I feel like. And my next palette will be a slam dunk for a fall palette. This won't take me very long to get through, I would be willing to bet. So I'm hoping, you know, probably end of August, we'll be looking at reviewing this and getting into another palette or two that maybe I really want to touch. That Natasha Denona Yucca palette has been calling my name since I brought it in. But and I know I can use it. I like to review a palette before I put it into my general population of palettes. So there's that. So this will be the palette that we're reviewing next time, is what I'm trying to say. And I hope that you guys are going to stick around, hit that subscribe button so that you're notified when I do upload that video. I hope that you loved this palette roulette review of the two melt palettes that I just got done reviewing. Do you have Millennial Pinx and Electrip? I would love to know your thoughts on specifically Millennial Pinx, because I'm just really disappointed in that palette, but also super happy to have it in my collection. So with that said, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope that you and yours are doing well, that you're getting along as best you can in this crazy world that we're living in, and that you are all loving each other, but loving each other from afar. And until next time, bye friends.